The proceeding will start shortly.
1. Order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Wednesday, the 20th of March 2024. Today we're looking at how government has delivered value for money from major government investment projects and the lessons learned from that. So thanks to the National Audit Office that's looked at a number of generally successful programmes to see whether after they've been delivered there's been a proper evaluation and discussion about whether they actually achieved their aims. Because navigating the unique and novel challenges of major programmes is crucial to securing the best value from public money. But all too often we see projects and programmes that are poorly managed, poorly delivered, often delivered late and over budget, which is obviously has a huge impact on the taxpayer and the user of whatever that project is. And so we want to know that government is looking more, as we have as a committee, at how it better evaluates the outcomes of some of these major programmes. And we're keen to hear from our witnesses today about how we can together help hopefully educate Whitehall and the system to deliver better projects. So I'm really pleased to welcome two witnesses today to this session. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority's Chief Executive, Nick Smallwood, is with us, and he's joined from His Majesty's Treasury by Conrad Smewing, who's the Director General for Public Spending. And just to be clear, because obviously Cat Little has now, is in the throes of moving over to the Cabinet Office as Permanent Secretary, and that we've had some information that your role has slightly changed. Do you want to just explain to us what your role now includes, Mr. Smewing?
Yeah, that's right. So Cat Little is in the process of moving into the Cabinet Office, so I am stepping up as co-head of the Government Finance function, filling one of her shoes there. We'll have another co-head of the Government Finance function, the kind of process to sort that out now. And in terms of the sort of Treasury's responsibilities for public spending, I'm taking on most of the day-to-day responsibilities that Cat undertook. Beth Russell is taking over public spending.
So Beth Russell, the second Permanent Secretary, based in the Darlington campus.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So Cat Little goes, and how many of you are taking on her jobs? Well, that's some testament.
Indeed, as I say, big shoes to fill.
Yes. Anyway, well, thank you. It's just helpful to know. So you've got other things on your plate other than what we're discussing today. But without further ado, and I know some people will be coming in and out of the room because there's been problems with queues getting into the building, so apologies to anyone who's had that challenge. But I'm going to turn straight away to Peter Grant MP to kick off. Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon to our witnesses. Can I first of all apologise in advance? I may need to leave at some point. I'm supposed to be at another committee later on, and I'm trying to find out whether I'm more desperately needed there than here. I think the two chairs will be in discussion about the transfer fee later on. But if we can just start from the general principles, some people might think it was a bit surprising that the NAO actually thought they had to include in the report the idea that you should start from the change that you want to deliver. You should think about how best to deliver it, and then you should arrive at the project. Whereas it sometimes seems as if the politicians announce a project and leave you guys to work out what it's going to mean. First of all, is that a fair comment? Is it too easy for politicians to decide on a big idea and to announce it before they've really thought it through?
I think the way the system is set up, and the kind of guidance in the Green Book, and the theory of how this should work, very much starts from exactly the same place as the NO is saying. You start from the what you're trying to do rather than any individual solution, and then you set your strategic objectives. Work out a long list of options which could meet those objectives, and then down select to a short list. That is how it is supposed to work, and I think in the majority of situations it does work like that. That's not to say that there aren't, obviously some circumstances in which people are light on a sort of particular project. And are, that has some sort of momentum before you start. But I think the strength of the framework should be there to make sure you're assessing that properly against all the other options you have. And if it is genuinely the best value for money way of pursuing your ultimate goal, select it only then.
Can I just maybe add to that? I absolutely agree with the NAO's observation, and to the point that we've actually spent a lot of time in the last 2 to 3 years developing tools that take you on exactly that journey of being clear on outcomes. So we developed the project outcome toolkit. We've got the route map tools to use for project setup, and opportunity framing, all of which really challenge stakeholders to be really clear on what are the objectives they're trying to deliver. And getting alignment to stakeholders is really key. When we don't do that, typically we have worse outcomes.
Thank you. The examples that the NEO chose to look at in more detail are essentially ones that appear to have gone well. So they're looking to see what lessons have been learned when things have worked. Obviously, if things don't work, then there's a different set of lessons to be learned. But looking at two, for example, the Millennium Dome and the London Olympics, most of us would instinctively think we would know what the potential benefits could be of hosting the Olympics or a major sporting event. And you'll regularly see enthusiasm from governing bodies saying we would really like to host the World Championships or whatever. It's harder to see how anybody at some point said, wouldn't it be great to have a great big upside down Super Bowl planted on the Greenwich Peninsula, and what a great project it would be. How do you put together a process or a system for evaluating these potential projects when you're trying to deal with such completely different sizes, scales and natures of beasts?
Well, I think what you're trying to do in your kind of business case options appraisal is, first of all, like, clarify what your strategic objective is up front, and that could be a very wide range of things. So it could be economic regeneration in the East End of London. It could be increasing participation in sport. It could be a kind of combination of those things. So I think there's no sort of perfect yardstick. You need to establish what your actual objective is and then assess options against that. And that's one of the things that we tried when we revised the Green Book a couple of years ago, to sort of try and make it clearer to people that you start with an objective and then work out the best value for money way of delivering that objective. And some of these objectives are impossible to compare against. So it's very difficult to compare the nuclear deterrent against kind of regeneration in the East End of London. But once you have been clear about what that objective is, I think then it is much more tractable to make an assessment, both of costs and of the range of benefits that you'd like to get, including much wider benefits, and go through your sort of business case process of working out how you will actually deliver it.
I think that the nature of the projects that we're delivering on the government major project portfolio are complex and quite broad, and really challenging, actually, I think, for departments to fully embrace what the potential upsides might be. What we do want them to do is think about social value, think about the 5-case business model, think beyond how they've traditionally looked. And I think the examples in the NEO report were all very positive upsides. I take the Jubilee line every day from Canary Wharf, and I don't think the Jubilee line expansion ever envisaged the scale of the benefits to the country of Canary Wharf development. But we do at least want to make a stab, and probably it's just as well if it's a conservative stab rather than overly optimistic stab. So a number of tools being developed, lots of work with the evaluation task force to try and improve how we perform in that space.
One of the issues that the NEO have picked up in relation to a number of these projects is that very often the actual sort of long-term benefits will take a lot longer to be realised than you might think, so that you can look at a nice new shiny building or a lot of nice new buildings, but the actual sort of long-term economic benefit to real-life people might be 5 years, 10 years down the line. First of all, is that a fair observation for them to have made, and maybe more difficult? What have you done to change that, looking at the experience of these other projects?
So it is definitely, the NA are absolutely right to say that, particularly with some of the kind of bigger, wider economic regeneration benefits of these big projects, you're looking at sort of decades, not like a short-term period, and it is inherently uncertain. So at the outset of the project, you can make an assessment of the likely regeneration benefits, but you will never kind of really be able to know for sure. I think the kind of really important thing in those circumstances is making sure you've got the sort of structures set up around the project in order to maximise the chance of delivery of those benefits. There's a couple of references in the report, for instance, to having development corporations set up, for the land around, big stations on HS1, having those kind of tools to ensure that you're maximising the chance of getting the wider benefits, I think is an important part of it. Nick,
I think there's more we can do. The Gate 5 review typically closes out a project at completion of the asset build, if you will. That's the start of the journey, isn't it? Because that's when you actually have something that can realise value. And getting more robust and more professional benefits realisation plans, and agreeing how long are we going to check the benefits, the economic benefits. And I think all too often we're too short-focused rather than looking at the longer term. And we need that learning. I think there should be a feedback loop to help understand what did we do really well on HS1 that we could then repeat on HS2.
When it comes to sort of shorter-term economic forecasts, we have the Office for Budget Responsibility, who were set up essentially to try to make sure there was some kind of basis for the kind of the facts that politicians could then argue about. Is there anything similar for these major projects, so that if a minister stands up and says, and it will deliver 20,000 new jobs within 5 years, is there an independent assessment of those kind of figures made at the time?
So it's certainly not within the purview of the OBR, who are going to be looking at the aggregate level for sort of an kind of ex post once the project is completed. I think the gold standard that you should be looking for in an evaluation is having a sort of independent evaluation that is comparing against a sort of realistic counterfactual of what has actually been delivered. Before the project has started, it is definitely harder. You can make a kind of estimate of costs and of benefits, and the way the approval process works and the way that the Treasury and the IPA and others interrogate the sponsors of projects tries to kind of make sure that you are being realistic in costs and in your kind of likely benefits. So that is a bit of a safeguard. There is also in this space the Independent National Infrastructure Commission, who gives advice on the overall infrastructure needs, economic infrastructure in particular, of the UK economy. So that does present a sort of independent analysis of likely needs and therefore likely benefits. So that is one body which is helpful here.
And maybe I can add to that. One issue that we're working on right now is to build a benchmarking data hub. So really excited that we should be retaining all the data around our capital projects within government to inform us for the next project or similar project. We typically don't do that today. The IPA has now built a hub subject to funding. I'm going to expand and really populate that so that we'll have access and really help us with the should cost modelling of projects rather than rely on the supply chain to tell us.
Thank you. And finally, for me, how good are we at allowing for the whole life cost of a project? Because you mentioned, for example, you built the building, that's the end of the project. The building still has to be maintained. In the case of the Millennium Dome, nobody had thought about what to do with it once we'd finished having Millennium events in it. Are we any better at envisioning what the longer term future is going to look like and what resources will be needed to make it happen?
So definitely that whole life costing is sort of central to the appraisal process, and all of the comparison of options is going to be looking at whole life cost. For something like the Millennium Dome, when you're thinking about what the opportunities might be for using it further down the line, that can be kind of pretty uncertain thing to judge at the point of the business case. But in general, thinking about the whole life cost, and in particular the cost of running and cost of maintaining, is central to the sort of options appraisal. There is a sort of further, there's a further question there in ensuring you do manage those whole life costs once the project is in flight, where making sure that you're putting the right amount of investment into maintaining the assets and not sort of starving them of maintenance funding. That is a sort of important thing post appraisal and post completion of the project, where I think we need to make sure that we've got the right incentives and structures to do that. I don't know, Nick, if you would add.
Yeah, I think it's an area we can do a lot better in. And the whole net zero agenda is driving us to actually lower the operating costs and be focused in that space, which is good. The CDM regs require you to think about disposal and dismantling of an asset at the end of life. So we're going to be improving
the CDM construction
design modifications regulations.
Okay, thank you.
And I think also the anecdotal evidence we have from the PFI off-boarding programme shows us that we haven't actually done a very good job of long-term whole life costing and maintenance. So it's got focus now, I think, to improve going forward.
Thank you. I mean, PFI is actually a really good case in point. We've looked at this and are quite concerned about how much planning needs to be in place and how we won't go revisit that report. But are you aware of any evaluations being done about the end of PFI that would inform future programmes?
Yeah, my team are doing a lot of work on doing the health checks as we offboard PFIs, looking at what best practice looks like. What are we learning from the different asset classes? So we've got quite some data together now within the IPA.
Will that include going into the design side of it? Because obviously on things like ongoing maintenance costs, if you've got a ceiling so high that you have to have scaffolding up to change a light bulb, that's a very challenging for the organisation that's running the building. So will you be looking at all those aspects as well as the PFI denouement itself?
The overarching messaging is about running costs rather than design. I think we've seen typically the projects have been built to time and cost actually, which is encouraging. But I'd have to check on whether we've got the access to the design information.
Well, I remember there was some discussion, wasn't there, a few years ago when Michael Gove was the Education Secretary about, I think, was he banning curves in buildings or something? I can't remember the detail. But I think it was an attempt, I think that under the headline there was an attempt to try and standardise certain things to make it cheaper to run. So is that something that's built in?
That's absolutely built into a number of programmes. So we're seeing that in the prison building programme where design one, build many is the philosophy. Yeah. The hospital building programme moving to a kit of parts, if I dare mention it.
Oh, we dare, yes, we have. Again, people may want to see our report on that as well.
But I think with that programme, we're now making good progress actually on the Hospital 2.0 design. That will drive down the cost per square metre, and we are thinking about the operating cost, and we're also thinking about net zero. I think the school building programme is probably ahead of both prison building and hospital building, and are building today net zero schools, which is really commendable. So we are seeing that standardisation increase, and the more you move to modern methods of construction, off-site fabrication, the more opportunities come, and the more we use digitalisation and data, design one, build many, and use the same data, you get standardisation.
Okay. There's lots of discussions we have about standardisation, but one of the things when we visited one of the hospitals that will be under the 2.0 programme is that there are not many manufacturing sites for modular off-site build. So when you're looking at these and learning lessons, particularly I suppose at the IPA, but it would also obviously feed through to the Treasury, where in the system do you send the suggestions or the learning that if we're going to do this and it's cheaper to standardise, cheaper to build design one, build many, that there's therefore another bit of the system needs to think about supporting or encouraging a factory or a producer?
Well, indeed, you have to do the homework on what makes economic sense. To just do off-site fabrication as a standalone, it could cost a lot more money, actually.
I think it does in the short term, isn't it?
It does short term. Yeah. So you have to have scale, you have to have economies of scale and repeat work, and that's about having a supply pipeline to the same MMC supplier so that they've got continuity of work.
And that's beyond you, though, isn't it? Because that's a policy decision.
That's then in the departments in the individual projects. But we do challenge. So that's one of the challenges for the hospital programme. They will have to stand up the supply chain. It doesn't exist today. But there's a willing market, actually. So one of the benefits you get from off-site fabrication is you avoid the problems of the weather. You've got a different access to a different market of skills. And you've got repeatability, so you can automate. So your unit costs can come down and certainty goes up. So it's attractive to industry if you give them that pipeline of certainty.
Okay. I mean, it's interesting, though, how it's a policy decision, but you're seeing, as you well described, the problem. But, so, Mr. Smewing, IPA says this. You at the Treasury have some hand in this. What do you do with that information?
One of the important sort of links here is actually often through the spending review process. So what we tend to do is involve the IPA in kind of considering both the deliverability of the bids and looking at the cost estimates and looking if it could be done more efficiently or essentially improve the productivity of the capital budget using these kind of things. And that is a kind of that's quite a very early stage in the process of thinking about setting up a program or a set of projects, and you can kind of inject the thinking at that point, and also in the early stages of the approval process, the IPA and the Treasury are kind of hand in glove on, making sure that we think that the programme is set up to deliver the best value for money, and if that involves, pushing further down the standardisation route or not, that's the opportunity for us.
If I'm uncharitable about the Treasury, you're a bit of a cash-in, cash-out economy, and that you grant the money and you expect it to be spent in the year. So if you're looking at a long-term programme like modular building, and it is more expensive up front, and who's going to get the benefit of a supply chain? Well, might be the NHS in this case, because there will be enough of a volume, but it equally could be potentially schools and other buildings. So how are you building in the extra costs that might be there to sort of prime a bit of industry to deliver, whether it's modular buildings or anything else, into the business plan? Because it might not make it good cost effective in the beginning, but it might be over a longer period of time.
What we would typically try to do is identify the best value for money way of delivering a programme, and then check against affordability, and then size the scale of the programme to do that, so that you're not sacrificing better value for money because the upfront cost is lower. It's sort of often the case that when the Treasury is thinking about an investment which is going to pay off in the sort of medium to long term, we'll sort of set aside extra money either from central funds or as part of the spending review in order to pursue that. That doesn't mean that there isn't. I agree, there is an inherently a tension between affordability and in some cases delivering investments which will pay off, and in those circumstances you've got to direct your resources to the kind of highest return investments that you've got available to you. And
we've talked before, and you've been in the room when we've talked about cross-government working and bidding jointly to the spending review. Relatively few do that. In terms of delivering on major projects, cross-government working can be very important. Do you think there's enough that happens in looking at major projects? And have you got any good news stories, and where are the challenges still?
So it's definitely it's definitely a difficult problem. Lots of people have identified exactly the problem and the difficulty of where there are future benefits for one section of government, but the costs are falling on another. It can be difficult to bring people together, and it can also be difficult to ensure the proper level of prioritisation in individual. If individual departments recognise it's a good thing to do, but it's not right at the top of their priority list, it can fall off the agenda. But one of the areas where I think we did this well in the last spending review, which we will definitely be looking on to build on and expand for the next spending review, is in the sort of the Joint Combating Drugs Unit, I think, the JCDU, where we encouraged all of the departments involved to come together with a joint bid and set up. They set up the kind of the right governance framework with all the ministers on a kind of cross-ministerial board to do that investment where if it is successful, you're essentially doing preventative spending that impacts all over different departments and saves.
And we've obviously looked at that separately as well. But in this case, let's say take the modular building, for example. You could apply, if it's working for hospitals, it could apply it to other areas. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be much read across on different.
Yeah, there is actually. So maybe I can give a couple of examples of where we've got cross-government opportunities. So the IPA chair the Government Construction Board, at which we have those very conversations about transforming infrastructure performance, of which MMC is one of the opportunities. So good conversations and good cross-learning, I think, at that forum. We've also
that includes skills and industry?
Indeed. In fact, we've just kicked off this week market analysis of skills and skill shortages over the next 5 years, because we think there are going to be some pinch points. So the cross-government construction board is one. We've also got the project council, where the chief project delivery officers are now accountable to me for driving performance improvement in their departments. So all the departments represented, CDDO, Treasury, and we get together quarterly to really challenge each other, share best practice. And the number 10 delivery unit now is quite mature, where we get the central teams together and scrutinise project delivery and just challenge, is there something that the centre could do in terms of an intervention that we're not doing? And then other forums like the 25-year Environment Board, which I sit on, and again, all departments represented, where we have a good conversation about the net zero challenges. So I think we're starting to see that cross-department conversation maturing and happening. It's not perfect, but I think I've seen huge change in the last 2 years.
And you've been in post, I think, since 2019,
yes,
so
correct.
5 years.
Yeah.
So, and I think in that time you've seen some change at the delivery team at delivery approach from number 10.
Yes.
So you're saying now what's in there is working better than
Absolutely,
than they've
absolutely.
seen.
So the work that Dr. Emily Lawson did to set up the delivery unit has been really good.
That's helpful because there's a lot. Election year, all sorts of discussion about delivery. And just on governance, what would you say in terms of, I mean, we've seen different models of governance for some of these projects that the NEO has highlighted. What do you think works best in governance terms? I'll start with you, Mr. Small.
Having the competent people present at the right phase. So it doesn't help putting a delivery expert in post-FBC. You need to be in the planning phase to make sure that you're setting up the project for success. I think the Crossrail Lessons Learned made some really good observations. And I think we can probably strengthen our guidance in that space, if I'm honest. I think pockets exist of good practice, but we haven't brought it together into one single space. The IPA are preparing and delivering some training material for boards, project boards, of what good looks like. And I think we need to just challenge, have we captured all the Crossrail lessons and put it into practice?
Yeah, so we certainly see with UK government investments and some others and some of the we've looked at non-exec appointments recently, some of the right people coming in. But we also have seen a lot on this committee. I think you made the point about the right skills in the right place, but even at non-exec level, non-execs either not turning up if they're sometimes from a government department because they've got other things on their plate, non-execs staying on beyond their competency, whether the project has changed. So are you, when you talk about maybe changing guidance, can you just give a bit more clarity about what you might be doing, when you might be doing it, and what you might want to say?
We've only just had the Crossrail report this week, so we're busy scrutinising that, so it would be wrong for me to give you a timeline when we're going to fix something. But I think we realistically do need to cover non-exec roles, governance boards. I've seen a number of senior boards set up across departments on some of the big energy projects, for example, and they're having a real impact. So an officials discussion to make sure...
When you say senior boards, that is officials only, or are they bringing
officials
outside?
only, but to inform them of how confident and competent they think the arm's length body is in delivering the outcome. So that's something I didn't see on HS2, for example, but now on Sizewell, on CCUS, on others. They're quite impactful boards, and I think that's a best practice that we need to encourage others to take on board.
Do you think there's a sort of deficit of skill and understanding about what non-executives do inside the civil service? Because the non-execs brought in from outside are obviously in that bracket, but there's when people are appointed from a department to be a non-exec, as I say, we've seen too often, look at attendance not being there, perhaps not being in the room is obviously one problem, but not always following it as closely as they might be. Just there as a nominee, but not really engaged. Is that an issue that we've seen it? Is that something you see too?
I don't see it regularly and repeatedly. I've seen it in pockets. Right now I'm being asked through the IPA to give opinion on the non-exec appointments for HS2, which I think is good. The fact they've asked us is really good. I'm personally now the government rep on Sizewell as a NED. And with that comes legal responsibilities. Yes. And so not attending is not okay.
Good. I'm glad you said that very clearly. We think so too, but it's heartening that you're saying that. That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Ben Lay-Kempy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming this afternoon. I'd just like to touch a little bit upon stakeholder engagement. And you've already mentioned, Mr. Smallwood, the importance of different governance models and making sure that people are involved during the delivery of the planning, stage, the delivery phase, and then post-delivery. And in paragraph 20 of the NEO report, it's mentioned that it's really the case that the project delivery team alone can deliver the full value of a project. Our case examples show that delivering value often requires a range of organisations and stakeholders to work together and have a clear understanding about their roles. And then further on in the report, in paragraph 23, the NAO state that our case examples indicate that in some cases it may be more effective for an organisation outside of the project delivery team to take responsibility and accountability for ensuring that the project delivers value post-delivery. I'm just interested, how effective is government working with external stakeholders in particular to make the most of assets once a project has been delivered?
So it's a challenging space for sure on some of the major infrastructure projects, but the National Infrastructure Planning process requires that engagement. Informal, formal planning inspectorate will require specific engagements. To go beyond that, to make sure that the key stakeholders are involved is really key. And where I see projects doing a really good job of their planning preparation, they go that extra mile to engage the key stakeholders, the dissenters as well as the supporters. And if you then take that on to who has influence over value, where you see opportunities for growth, like on HS2 on the stations, for example, there's been good engagement in the communities and councils around all 4 stations, because that's really where there's huge potential value to come. Of the order of 20 billion is the last figure I saw. And where we saw it in Ebbsfleet on HS1, I think you see real benefit. That takes energy and time, and it's time well spent, so we need to encourage it to happen more often. Where I see real best practice is where we're now embracing technology, digital technology, so you can actually visualise the end result of a project, which actually kind of means you can't rush to put spades in the ground. You need to do the detailed design work and front-end development to a level of maturity that you can show a visualisation of what the end result will be. Where that's been done, A303, Lower Thames Crossing, they've used it to really good effect in the planning cycle, getting stakeholders on board and getting positive support for what essentially could have been a blocked project. So lots more we can do, lots of best practice we can learn from.
And those examples you referenced there in terms of the best practice, are they being rolled out in a systematic way now across government? Because it strikes me as eminently sensible that you identify those stakeholders very early on. I don't think it comes naturally to everyone, but we do have what's called the assurance gate reviews that the IPA convene, and we do challenge to make sure that we're learning from one project to the other. And having identified, just so that my understanding is clear on this, once you've identified the relevant stakeholders in a particular project, are they then involved throughout the delivery phase so that they have a good understanding of the asset that they will potentially be inheriting? And
absolutely. So if you take a project like Sizewell, they've got a local liaison community forum actually set up in the local town, and that will stay for the life of the project.
And again, sorry to labour the point, but is that something, that liaison committee or a similar forum, is that something that is starting to be applied across the way that we deliver the project?
I think it would be wrong to say it always happens without fail. It needs to be encouraged to happen without fail, because I think you have to embrace your stakeholders.
Just to add on this, on things like the really big kind of transformational rail and transport projects, I think there is a sort of emerging best practice of having something like some kind of board that can bring together all of the local authorities and all of the quite wide range of central government departments you need to really drive value from things. So it's not just the Department for Transport; it's also housing, it's also kind of economic regeneration and jobs. So on the East West Rail, I think there is a sort of a Treasury sort of East West Rail growth board that brings all of those people together to try and make sure that you do make the whilst you're building the railway, do the best to get all of the broader benefits around it. And I think that is built on the kinds of models that you saw for HS1 that are mentioned in the report and things like that.
And thank you, Mr. Smithing. That's very helpful. And I think what you're saying is that the Treasury does consider or recognise the way in which some of these major projects can drive growth and regeneration. And with that in mind, then, how does the Treasury encourage departments to put in place the measures and investments necessary to really maximise the growth? The NAO report, and indeed you've also referenced projects like High Speed 1 and the benefits at St Pancras, Ebbsfleet, and so on. How does the Treasury go about encouraging the department to really recognise the potential contribution of these major projects for growth?
Well, I mean, the example I just gave absolutely sort of hits that point. So set up the East West Rail Growth Board to have all the relevant departments and the local authorities on, because it's kind of central to the Treasury's kind of conception of these major projects, that they are going to deliver much broader economic benefits and broader growth. And it's not always the case that you've got a project that is large enough that you want the sort of Treasury to corral everyone. And in those cases, Department for Transport and Department for Levelling Up will be kind of coordinating themselves. But on these sort of really big projects, there's often some Treasury involvement.
Thank you. Mr. Smallwood, if I can ask a question related to paragraph 15 in the NAO report, where they state the importance of taking steps to maximise the use of an asset and therefore the potential value from the investment. Also came through from some case examples, and specifically the diamond light source as an important piece of UK national infrastructure. I just want to ask you, what more do you think government could do to maximise the use of its assets to drive growth and regeneration? And particular reference to the diamond light source, but there will be other examples, I'm sure.
Well, we touched on it a little bit earlier, the 5-case business model, and really thinking beyond the delivery of the asset specifically, but challenging what other social and economic benefits could accrue from it, and really being broad in the thinking and driving project teams to do that early in the piece. And then that gets translated into a benefits realisation plan, and then you can really start to have the dialogue with the right stakeholders. We need to do a better job in that space. It's difficult. Some of these projects, you see them delivered, and then the light bulb goes on and people realise there's a side benefit they hadn't considered. We want to just do a better job of trying to think more broadly earlier. It's very difficult for some, very easy for some of the projects. A rail project, housing is an obvious one at stations, very clear. Yeah. But what else might accrue? Are the benefits in terms of reduced energy consumption? And those don't come naturally. I think we need to really challenge project teams to think more broadly.
And is it, thank you, that was a very useful answer, but I agree with you, it's a challenging sort of thing and a way of looking at a project. Do you have any thoughts as to which department of government or which element of a project team is best placed to do some of that thinking?
It does sit with the departments. I draw attention to both Department for Transport and Department for Energy and Net Zero. They're really taking benefits realisation seriously. They're really pushing that agenda, getting the training through and trying to up their game, because of course they are two departments with very high capital spend. We need to encourage that to happen across the piece.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lake. Mr. Peter Grant, MP.
Thanks, Chair. Have you made any progress in making sure that the budget for a project includes a realistic amount of money and time to carry out proper evaluation while the project is underway?
So I think it's not so much a budgetary issue as a kind of ensuring people have the right focus on it, because as a proportion of the cost of these major projects, the evaluation is going to be quite small. I think we have made some progress, but I definitely think that there is a lot more that we can do. So, you will know that back in 2019, when we looked at the level of kind of evaluation plans across the GMPP, the level was quite low. I think it was sort of like 8%. That was one of the kind of catalysts for setting up the evaluation task force in I think it's SR20. As a sort of as a means of both holding people to account that they are kind of following the guidance that they have evaluations, but also helping them, helping people design a proper, robust evaluation of a major project, which sometimes doesn't look straightforward from the out, and these can be difficult projects to properly evaluate. But I think the ETF has made a load of progress. I think it's engaged with several hundred different programs and projects across.
Who's on the evaluation task force? What professional skills are on there?
So they are sort of professional social researchers in the main, and also economists. So it's headed by Catherine Hutchinson, who used to be in the analysis function of a department, so kind of knows how the individual directors of analysis in individual departments think about things and how they operate. Her staff tend to be professional evaluators who are there to offer kind of advice on how you would design things. And this can be both how to design a study, but also how to think about the rollout of your project or program or policy so that it is more evaluatable.
Do you have policy professionals in that at all?
Yes, there are policy professionals in there as well, and we have very close links between the spending teams in the Treasury and the ETF, so that when it comes round to sort of spending reviews, we often bring the ETF in to give us their assessment of the state of evidence in a particular area or on a particular policy, so that you need a kind of the full life cycle that the Treasury is both asking for the evidence on how effective this project or policy is going to be, and
you're trying to drive the behaviour. Because I remember that both the head of the policy function, Tamara Finkelstein, and the deputy head of the policy function, Susan Ackland, both permanent secretaries, have talked about the need for looking in policy, when policy is developed, looking at it from end to end, delivery and through to evaluation. But do you think that's getting better?
I do think it is getting better. I think the ETF have been very successful. There is always more to do here, and these evaluations always take longer than the
politicians
would want. But nevertheless, like the things that we are sort of setting up around them, including particularly like transparency in where these evaluations are being performed or not performed, what the outcomes are. So the ETF is setting up a registry of all of the evaluations. I think it's going to produce later this year.
That would be
That's quite a powerful tool. Yeah.
And how do you make sure this isn't cut? I'll come back to Mr. Grant, but I remember when I was a minister, there was a cut to the departments, and I was the science minister. The social science fund was in the frame because it was something that people wouldn't really notice if it was cut, and I pled against it being cut, saying that will cause problems down the line. You need to think long term with a gap in knowledge and information, and it was relatively small. But there's always a risk, isn't there, that it doesn't seem important when you're trimming costs on a budget, on a programme. So how are you going to make sure that the evaluations are written in? As Susan Ackland Hood said to us when we were looking at this in her department, it's a rounding error in a budget. So are you making sure that it's relatively small, in other words, in terms of the overall cost? How are you making sure that it's embedded?
Absolutely. So, the Treasury is a huge supporter of all of this stuff, and so, we are going to be kind of frowning on anyone that suggests that saving, as you say, a rounding error in the budget in order to, by cutting social research, is not going to be something that we are going to be recommending. I think there's a couple of, other points here for. In some areas, it has been helpful for us to have budgets for evaluation held centrally. So the ETF has an evaluation accelerator fund, where if for one reason or another resourcing is a problem, departments could bid into that. So that is another way that we can support people.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. As a committee, we often find that departments push back very hard, even on projects much smaller scale and complexity than we're talking about here. They push back very, very hard at the idea that there should be any kind of robust quantitative evaluation built in at the start and then sort of monitored and reported on later on. And I know that the NAO have highlighted that in essence there hasn't really been a culture change in the last 10 years, the last time the NAO looked at that. What is it we need to do to change the culture so that people who are in charge of setting up and starting to deliver these projects that are costing billions of pounds of public money, that they understand from day one that they have got to build in the evaluation at the start, and they've got to be held properly to account against that evaluation throughout the project?
Okay, and then you might want to come in. So there's definitely lots that we can do at the centre. The Treasury and the IPA making clear, both with our sort of hard levers around approvals and conditions in spending reviews, but also in the way that we conduct ourselves and demand evidence and use that evidence in making decisions. I think that is an important thing. I think it is also the case that these sorts of discussions in the NAO's report on the people that run these major projects do want both to make a difference in the world and be able to show that they have done so. And some of the really encouraging case studies in this report, for instance, like the Diamond Light Source study, they've done the project, they've done a really good evaluation of what the impact of that has been. That has helped make the case for further investment in the Diamond Light Source, to follow on. It's that kind of cycle that I think can really, change people's minds. But I don't know if you...
I think I would add that Conrad and I have written out to all the SROs starting this week, actually, requiring them to demonstrate their benefits realisation cases because there simply are too many gaps in the GMPP. And it is the responsibility of the SRO to take ownership of it. We've done a lot of work in the IPA to strengthen the training that goes to the SRO community, to increase their length of tenure in role and the time commitments that they make on the projects. I think that's having an effect, a positive effect. There's more to do, but I think it's very clear where the accountabilities sit, and we need to chase now that they start to show us the evidence of the evaluation plans.
Thank you. On part of your last comment, Mr. Smearing, you said that people that are in charge of these projects want to be able to demonstrate that they've delivered. Is it the case that they want to be able to demonstrate after a very robust and independent evaluation process, or do they simply want to be able to say we've been a success and nobody can prove otherwise because you haven't collected information?
Well, that's where we need to have a decent standard of what is required to prove that you have actually made a difference and had a positive impact. So I definitely agree with you that sort of simply producing something which is a bit self-serving to sort of say, here are the outcomes without some sort of proper estimate of the counterfactual and some attempt to demonstrate the causality of the impact of the project on it. That's not good enough. And one of the things that like the ETF and the Treasury do is try and set out what does good look like in an evaluation here, so that we can say yes, no, you're right, you have made an impact. I do have some sympathy, particularly on some of these really big projects in particular areas, for instance, like defence, where it can be very difficult to set up a proper counterfactual, and as we mentioned earlier, the timescales are so long that it's very difficult to have what you might think of as a sort of gold standard evaluation. But there are always things that you can do short of that. Like, are you delivering the outputs that you expected? How is the asset that you've constructed performed? So there's always things you can do.
Yeah, one area that's fundamental to doing a robust evaluation is getting the cost estimate right in the first place, and that is a skill as well as an art, and it's an area we need to do better. We're weaning project teams off what's historically been a fixation on reference class forecasting, which I think is fine in early phases, but when you've got to develop...
Well, just explain that in just because
reference class forecasting is looking at something that's maybe similar and applying the cost logic to your future project, but perhaps often missing the unique specifics of location and the detail around that asset. It's much more straightforward, more accurate to have a bottom-up cost estimate once you know what it is you want to deliver. We wrote cost estimating guidance a couple of years ago, which I think is world-class. We've developed a community of cost estimators across government, all 19 departments. Now I think is the time to really home in on improving the quality of the cost estimates that come. Again, rather than relying on the supply chain to tell us what they think it's going to cost. And I think there's a real opportunity there with data and digitalisation to look at how the system performs, because you should be able to analyse how accurate are you on school building, how accurate are you on hospital building, on linear infrastructure, and then have a feedback loop to learn. And we simply haven't collected the data historically to do that.
That's the benchmarking hub.
Yeah, the benchmarking hub would allow us to do that, so to feed into the whole of the cost estimating process.
What's the timeline for that?
The benchmarking hub's built. We just need to populate it with department data.
So what's the timeline for when it will begin to be more useful?
I think later this year, subject to budget and resource to
and obviously
populate
the more
it.
data goes in, the more useful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Grant.
Thanks, Chair. We've already heard that the most recent figures that the NAO had in December 2019, 8% of the spend on major projects had robust impact evaluation plans in place. 64% of it didn't appear to have any evaluation arrangements in place. What would you consider to be the limits of acceptability in those figures? I mean, if 8% is not acceptable, how high does it need to be acceptable? And I'm assuming you don't think 64% of a £400 billion spend unevaluated. What is the maximum level you would allow that non-evaluated spend to be before you would just say it's not acceptable practice?
Well, so I think it's not acceptable for any of these major projects to have nothing in place. So as I say, there's going to be something that you can do on all of these, even for those major projects, often in defence, where having something which it's a sort of social researcher would regard as a robust evaluation is not going to be possible. So I don't think you're going to get to kind of I think the way to look at this is to sort of grade the quality of the evaluations, and I think you're not going to get like a really gold standard evaluation on all of these things. But that said, 8 is definitely too low, and I think you ought to be able to get to over time you ought to be able to get to 100 for something on all of these things. We're in the process of redoing the work that led to that original 8%. We're sort of reviewing and reassessing the GMPP
the government's
stands
major
on this.
projects.
Yeah. So we will see how far we've come and how far our admonitions have been successful and our levers have been successful.
I think most departments have gaps, but the dominant numbers sit in Department for Ministry of Justice, and the MOD. And MOD have certain circumstances we can't fix, but they can still do something. MOJ are actually being quite positive and now on the case to try and review how they can do a better job of benefits realisation. So I think we're going to see some short-term improvement.
Thanks. Apologise if I didn't catch it earlier. Do you know where those December 2019 figures are now? Do you have an update on the 8% and 64%?
We're doing the work required to get that update now. So I should hope that later this year we'll be able to come out with.
Can you write to us with that specifically?
Absolutely,
Although we'll be beyond the end of this report. No.
Thanks. If you look at the last annual report of the Infrastructure and Investments, the IP, I can't remember, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, almost exactly 90% of projects that are big enough to be included in your report were assessed as either red or amber in your last report. Now, I know the committee has spent time looking at a number of these in some detail. Almost every one of those projects that we've looked at, although we might not have worded it exactly the same, we've pointed to the basic lessons in this report, and there are catastrophic failures to comply with some of the basics. For example, the emergency service network, the stakeholder consultation just wasn't good enough. If we're not robustly and almost aggressively evaluating these projects as they go on, how can we hope to learn from the mistakes? First of all, learn from the mistakes of the ones that have gone disastrously wrong, and learn from the good practice of the ones that have worked.
Can I just check the figures you quoted? My figures suggest we've got 89% of projects are either amber or green, so only 11 that are red. That's been consistent for the last 2 years, although we're seeing an increasing trend in red-rated projects. But we've now implemented the Response to Red programme, where we actually look at a red-rated project and challenge it against the recommendations. And we're actually seeing that 70% of those projects that receive a red rating can get to amber or green within 12 weeks, which I actually think is quite good. I think the system is now functioning as it was intended, which is to not let projects convince themselves they would be okay, but rather be really robust in an assurance review and challenge them on deliverability, preferably before FBC so that we've got a chance to fix it. Many of the projects that you see are post-FBC, and I'm afraid we can't assure goodness into a badly developed project. And ESMCP is a good example of, if we had our time again, we wouldn't have done it the way we did it. But I think for the new projects coming down the track, I think we're seeing a different level of maturity of development. So it's really, a lot of the really knotty ones are turning to be red. Some of them as a result of high inflation, some of them as a result of overly ambitious ministerial schedules. There's always a really good reason why they are rated red. I think it's less so that they actually are not in control, for want of a better expression.
I don't know that the committee would accept overly ambitious ministerial schedules as being a good reason. It might be an explanation in that we can understand why it's happened, but I think part of our intention in doing all of these work is to find ways of making sure that ministers are a bit more realistic about what they promise. But just to clarify the figures that I've got from the 22-23 annual report was it was 9% red, 81% amber and 11% green. So if you take red plus amber together, it's about 90%. If you take red, amber plus green, it's about 90%. Are you able to tell us how many of the ones that were 9% in 22-23 have moved? Because I think you said that the ones that are red now, most of them should be able to move into amber or green fairly easily. How many of those 9% have moved?
Off the top of my head, I think it was about 70% we managed to move. But we've seen new reds appear, of course, so it's an evolving picture. And we've seen some of the red-rated projects actually did ultimately deliver on their plans. So it's an evolving picture.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Grant. I mean, we've talked a lot about the business planning of it, but obviously there's then the delivery of a project, and you still, Mr. Small, would have an oversight at that point.
Yeah.
The Treasury, well, we'll come to the Treasury about their oversight at that point. So what's going well and what's not going in terms of from after the business case? I don't know what gate that would be, but before it's completed, but after it's the business case, where are the weaknesses in that system, and have we got the right skills in the civil service to deliver these programs?
We've done a lot in the skills space in terms of developing and launching the Projects Academy, where we now assess and accredit our project delivery professionals and SROs. We've got almost...
So this is the Side Business School major...
This is Oxford Side Business School for the Major Project Leadership Academy.
Yeah.
We use Cranfield for the Project Leadership Programme. And we've got 4 levels starting from foundation up to master practitioner. We're just about to go through 1,000 assessed and accredited professionals, and it's not immediate. You have to do a lot of work to get accredited because you have to demonstrate your competence. You have to have attended the MPLA, for example, if you're a master practitioner, and you have to be a chartered project professional if you're a project director that wants to be a master. So it's quite a journey to get through.
How long does that journey take if you were someone senior, reasonably senior?
It would take a year or so to get through, unless you've already got the track record and evidence.
So a year or so, not so long then.
No, we have an ambition to get another 1,000 through by the end of March next year, which I think is credible. But we do have 16,000 professionals that we need to get through. So the focus needs to switch now to the GMPP and where we're spending the most money. Yeah. So that's our ambition for the next 12 months. So on skills, we're moving. But to your point on have we got the right skills, I think we need far more technical and engineering skills. I think we really have a gap there, and an over-dependence on the supply chain. Do you think that,
the civil service recruitment process isn't likely to bring in people at junior level who will grow in that? Are you looking at people coming in sideways into departments?
We've got a number of STEM graduates who are coming in, which is refreshing to see. I don't think we've got enough at the more senior levels operating the largest programs and projects, if I'm honest. And we need them, for sure, which is why assessment and accreditation is so important, because claiming you've been on the course but not having the skills to deliver is not good enough. We need to have the assessment. So a lot happening on skills. What could we do better? I think we need to be much more intelligent clients. And by that I mean being smarter at how we go to the supply chain and manage our contracts. And we're seeing some really great practice there. So whether it's the PPP contract at Sellafield, or actually a lot of good thinking now going into the hospital programme of how they're going to deliver this huge challenge. We didn't get that level of rigour on HS2, and we've seen the result. I think there's general mixed bag of competence in the supply chain itself, so you actually have to show up as an intelligent client to manage it. So that's a gap. And I think the biggest gap that we're going to have to resolve in the next few years is data and digital. Yeah. So that world is upon us, and we need to embrace it and use it to our benefit.
Yeah, I think all of the things we've highlighted as well, absolutely critical. But when you talked about earlier about senior responsible owners, and we've just talked about skills, but it's perhaps a bit unfair. Mr. Snewing's probably not the most, not senior enough to answer the question for the whole of the civil service. But do you think the rewards are in the right place? If you're getting people through the Major Projects Academy and Major Project Leadership Academy, we see often that the route through to senior civil service roles is not through these specialist technical skills. Do you think that's a problem, that we haven't got enough people at the most senior level who've actually delivered projects?
It's a problem that I think is within our gift to solve, actually. So one of the things I've challenged is, have we got the right level of civil servant as an SRO on a major project or programme? It doesn't have to be a junior to the next level up. You can have equal parity of grade. That's one lever we can pull for the appropriate projects. We've also secured pivotal role allowances for competent, assessed and accredited SROs. I would very much like to get the same in place for the programme directors, because we're seeing an increasing gap now growing between the private sector and civil servants.
Okay, that's and then I mean, one of the you mentioned defence earlier as a big challenge, and it has been repeatedly a challenge. They're obviously long projects. Because they're so expensive, a small delay or an error is hugely expensive. Could build a hospital or a school. I mean, we're talking in those sort of figures. Do you worry about that, Mr. Smallwood, about what's going on in defence, and what impact is the IPA having on defence projects?
So I think for defence, they are actually showing up in large numbers to get through assessed and accredited schemes. So our MPLA has a very healthy cohort of MOD representatives. Same on the PLP. Governance is a challenge, and we're looking at how can we simplify some of the governance models. Example would be in defence nuclear, where there's some good work being done by Mandy McTiernan to streamline that, get the right SRO in the right place doing the right work, which I think is an opportunity to improve. We've gone from almost no engagement with the IPA 5 years ago to absolutely open engagement. I have so many requests for help and input. It's a very healthy and positive engagement now.
That's good. And of course, you're presumably cleared to look at every bit of what the MOD is doing, or your teams are.
Within the resource constraints I've got within the IPA.
But basically
absolutely.
you have access to all the areas, so there's
Absolutely.
no hidden bit of the system that you're
No.
not able to
No.
talk to. Good, great. That's really helpful to know. And earlier you talked, just picking up on a few points here, you talked about social value,
Yes.
and also we've looked at, I remember when we looked, actually it was High Speed 1 and actually High Speed 2, the benefit cost ratio was, in fact, it was interesting. So for rail, at one point the benefit cost ratio included the loss. It took out the time on train travel because it wasn't valuable. Whereas those of us, many of us do travel, we know that the value of being away from our offices, away from our phones, sometimes is actually quite useful time to work. And we sometimes these benefit cost ratios are not taking into account the wider social value that job creation in an area could be a big value. Is there a better way that the system could be capturing social value? We've got the legislation that says we should be doing this, but is there a better way it could be done? Are there any areas for improvement there? Mr. Smewing, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think it's definitely the case that the benefit cost ratios in these projects can't capture all of these things which are very very difficult to quantify. That's one of the reasons why I think this was always the case, but in the update of the Green Book we were crystal clear that when you're thinking about project selection, you should be thinking about what your strategic objectives are, which will often include delivering that kind of social value, and choose the options which deliver that, and not be sort of slave to different benefit cost ratios, which, although they are a very useful sort of lens, are only one lens to look at how to think about a project. I think how to kind of capture it better. I think there are a couple of directions that you can go. I think it is possible to do better within the sort of quantitative appraisal to make some estimates of these kind of broader social values, recognising that they're going to be much more uncertain than your sort of direct monetary values. But it is better to attempt to quantify and weight than not quantify and weight. So that is, I think, something that we can do. And the Green Book team, who sort of work on this all the time, are definitely looking at ways that they can do that better. And then, as I say, I think the other way is to not forget that to come back to where we started in the NA report, you should think about what you're trying to achieve, which will include quite a broad range of things, and then see which options are really going to achieve.
I'll pick up on that, because on that, take just for example the Olympics. Job creation was a part of that. I'm thinking of Ebbsfleet is another slightly different issue, but there were sometimes then and the Olympics again, sporting community sports activity, but these were long range aims, and they haven't delivered, frankly, a lot of that. I mean, the Olympics I know well because some of the Olympic Park is in my own constituency, and the evaluation point, going back to some of the points that Mr. Grant was raising, how far on is the evaluation going? Is it going far enough? And what's the consequence? If you deliver the Olympics, everyone says fantastic, we had a great games, the volunteers loved it, my part of London got regenerated, we managed to get someone to buy the stadium, which was the big challenge, all tick, 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 Gate 5 reached, delivered, but actually Gate 5 hasn't been reached because the jobs and sporting activity across the UK particularly just haven't materialised in the same way as we've covered in this committee. So what's the consequence for a big project when it delivers on one level but doesn't deliver all that social value that was supposed to be part of it?
Well, I guess there's two things here. So we've had the Olympics, so we can't do it over again. So it's like lessons learned for like future similar projects. And I know that the DCMS.
And how are you capturing those lessons?
Well, so I think
because that wouldn't quite fall into. What would it fall into? It might fall into benchmarking data, but I'll come back to Mr. Small on that. But
I think my understanding. So I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is the DCMS, did a sort of review of like how it had delivered and what the benefits were of like a range of these things, Commonwealth Games, Olympics, and all that, to try and capture your sort of lessons learned for doing it again. And I suspect that some of those lessons are a bit more specialist to that particular kind of project. I think the other area here is something that we were talking about earlier, which is, do we have the right coordination around the project to make the most of it? including your sort of investment in housing and other regeneration. If you're putting a lot of money and effort and a big new project into a particular area, you need to, as we discussed earlier, kind of have all of the stakeholders lined up and a kind of proper plan for how you will capitalise on it. So I know that for instance, some of the big science projects that the STFC do, you're investing in a piece of science equipment which is going to attract researchers and all that, but you need space for spin-outs, support for people who are going to develop companies that come out of it, enterprise zones around it. Like you need that kind of coordination with it.
Yeah, and a hub of people. So will the benchmarking data hub include longer range evaluation?
It doesn't yet, but there's no reason why we couldn't consider that actually as a proposal.
There's a real bugbear for constituency MPs when we're told a project's being delivered in our area and there will be great jobs created, and then you dig in and you realise that postcode jobs doesn't mean someone's local. They can be living in a guest house or a hotel and they count as local. There's all sorts of ways that the system didn't work. Now with the Olympics it was a very tight deadline, so it was really hard to butt against that deadline. You need a concreting specialist, you needed a concreting specialist now. You couldn't wait to, that was then, I won't go into the pain of that, but I think we've all seen it in our own local areas. So, and that's, if we're talking, let's face it, we're facing an election this year. I think both Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor are talking about economic growth, so job creation is really critical, but it is a long-term thing because a 6-month job's different to a 10-year job.
What I am seeing is some good emerging work on our projects and programmes coming through development now. So if you look at the prison building programme, Fossway, 460 construction jobs, 71 of them were for ex-offenders. Okay. And they really went out of the way to maximise that. That's now continuing in the programme.
And you're watching to see if they keep their jobs.
And that's the bit that the long-term focus needs to be. In Sizewell, because it is a very long-term project, they're looking at STEM graduates and what can they do for the local community, employment opportunities, because there's a need for the project directly, so there's a win-win for the community as well. And I'm generally seeing the UN SDGs as a sort of a checkpoint. It's a really good tool to just challenge and check which ones are relevant to your project and are you maximising the benefit. So Sizewell has a particular problem on water because Suffolk is really short of water, so they're thinking very hard about how do they build this massive project with huge concrete to be installed and don't add to the water challenge. So I see it every day on new projects. How we capture that long term, I think we need to take away and think about.
Yeah, I think it's I'm very keen to take away and think about it. I'm particularly interested in, I think one thing that we could usefully do from the centre is lay out some guidelines on how you might assess and present these kind of evaluations, because sort of having seen quite a lot of sort of jobs created calculations before. There's a lot of different ways of doing it.
You're as cynical as we are, but you're too professional to say it. Yeah.
But there is a reality there that if you look at it in a kind of consistent and sensible way against a proper counterfactual, you can have more confidence in those numbers.
And of course, jobs created locally where people live and they end up staying can be very helpful. I just wanted to go back to this point about Gate 5, the end of the programme, and I'm wondering, you talk about that's not enough. I'm just picking up on what you were just saying about skills and jobs. Do you think there's perhaps an opportunity for a Gate 6, that longer term? Would you want to call it something like that, or just?
It might be, and maybe it's delivered by others. But I think
10 years
absolutely
on,
the benefits realisation plan needs to go beyond Gate 5. And I think if the plan is clear, who's going to do what by when or what time period, I think that would capture it.
That's helpful. And then we just touch on the transport, which I touched on earlier. But I mean, the Jubilee Line Ebbsfleet, which was very slow, the development around Ebbsfleet didn't happen until a long time after High Speed 1 was created. But it's well known that transport drives opportunity and jobs. So are we capturing the real benefits? I mean, we covered a bit of this earlier, but are there better ways, do you think, Mr. Smeon, we ought to be assessing transport projects? Because they are great, in terms of levelling up or equalities, access to education, access to jobs, housing, other regeneration opportunities around that. We're beginning to get an idea of what they can deliver because there being a number of projects, rail and road. Do you think we could be doing better at measuring the success of those?
I think the first thing to say is that in my experience, the DFT's kind of ability to quantify and assess the benefits of its projects is one of the best in Whitehall. They do have a really robust and clear methodology that's widely understood, that the Treasury is comfortable with. It can be a little bit on the cautious side, I think they would probably say so themselves, that they are sort of quite ready to say this is the benefit cost ratio, but there are a large number of unquantifiable benefits. And as I was saying earlier, I think it would be, even though it is right to say those kind of unquantifiable benefits are going to be in the end not knowable to the same level that you could, for instance, estimate journey times or journey time savings, those kind of things. I think you probably could get a bit further in saying, kind of ballpark, this is our kind of estimate of under these headings what you could do. But I know that the DfT far more expert in this than me, and they have very good people who think about it.
It's interesting if you talk to, the Metro mayors, all of them will talk about transport as a major plank, even if they don't have it in their powers. Often they want it because they see that as an economic regenerator.
Yeah,
so,
it's a
that's slightly segue. But I think almost finally for me, which bits of the system do you think need to change and how? If you had your top three asks of any bit of government, it's been a way, Mr. Small, well, both of you are in a kind of prime position already, being able to sort of indicate control, indicate cajole, I suppose, perhaps rather than control. What do you think, Mr. Smearing?
You go first. Yeah.
Oh, Mr. Small. I'm not trying to, not a trick question.
No. I'm thinking aloud that really the focus that would have the most impact would be to get a stronger grip of the largest of the government's major projects. So those mega projects, the giga projects that really are very challenging and difficult, to increase the rigour and assurance around those, to increase the quality of cost estimating, and actually track and challenge them through their life cycle rather than leave it to arm's length bodies. I think there's much more we can do in that space.
That would be for you to do, you think?
That would be for the IPA to do.
Yeah. Okay.
I think so. I would definitely, within that cost estimation, I think is one of the things where how we think about that and apply it in our decision making and spending reviews and in the Green Book, I think is still not quite cracked. Partly that is for reasons that they're outside of control of some of these projects. If you have a big wave of inflation, then you have a big wave of inflation.
You can account for that.
Exactly. So I think that, and then we talked about evaluation a lot. I still think that is not where it needs to be. If I could wave a magic wand, that's where I'd wave it.
So we've got So in terms of evaluation, we've covered quite a lot of, but in terms of making sure that we are changing the system, we've heard from the IPA. Is there anything in terms of financial levers that you think could incentivise departments to do a better job?
So I think one area that is really worth us looking into, and we are looking into for the next spending review, is duration of budget setting. So, I think it is pretty widely recognised that there are benefits to having longer term budgets, particularly for these kind of larger.
These committees are pining on
projects. And I think we definitely agree with that. At the moment, we have a little bit of a patchwork system. So some areas have quite long visibility on their budgets, some less so. And I think a bit of kind of levelling up there. Obviously, there are trade-offs there because you are losing some fiscal flexibility in doing that. The Treasury needs to think about. But I think that is an area that we should definitely look at the next spending.
We look a lot about there's optimism bias in nearly everything we look at, or the failure of projects, or it's going to be fine. And often one of the sources of that over-optimism is the politicians, our colleagues, the ministers, who are having to make decisions. Partly, a lot of academic writing on this, because it's very hard to convince if you're trying the narrative of a policy delivery to tell the public it's going to cost X billion. Is hard and sometimes the point at which you've got to get the public on board may be the point before you've got a business case, because it's a circular thing, isn't it? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So do you think that am I being pessimistic to think that there will still always be a challenge with politicians not wanting to be honest with the public, or not able to be honest, because to get the idea off the ground they have to float the idea before there's a cost attached, so therefore everyone's always talking about low costs from the beginning, not realistic costs?
I think we should always talk about ranges until we've done the work. It's very notable that HS2, I think, was 10% mature by the time we took FBC, so we really didn't know how much it was going to cost. Would you have made the decision differently Had we known that?
Or is it a final business case, or we should say for people who are listening?
Final business case,
yes, only
indeed.
10% mature at final business case.
But I think being honest about ranges and how accurate that range is helpful until we've done the work, actually.
I very much agree with that.
Reality will always come out in the end, is unfortunately what I've seen on major projects.
And I think also transparency on the vintage of estimation is a friend here as well.
Speak our language, Mr. Smewing.
Yeah.
We'll be pressing the Treasury then for more transparency on these things from now on.
Well, the publication in the GMPP, and the publication of business cases, all of that I think is sort of.
Yeah, and actually, I think what you're saying is an honesty to the public that you can't do things on the cheap. That if it's big, it's going to cost. Indeed. But it's keeping control of the cost. I'm going to briefly go to Mr. Grant and then to Mr. Lake.
Thanks, Chair. Do we just need to accept there's always going to be a limit? Because, for example, the person who delivers a project that the day after it finishes looks a great success, they've got their knighthood, they've got their promotion to a big job somewhere else, and over the next 10 years, if the real benefits don't appear, they've got the benefit from it. Do we need to simply recognise that is always going to be an issue, and therefore there's going to be a limit as to how closely we can get people to follow what I think we would both agree is best practice all the way through this?
I'm not sure I agree entirely with that. I think if you have if you've set up a project in the expectation of benefits and delivered what the project is supposed to have delivered, although it is always going to be the case that really long-term benefits 5-10 years down the line, you're not in control of those at the time. I think if you have built the power station that you were intending to build and it is like churning out the power, I think that is.
I agree. Okay. I think delivering on promises, because the external environment can always change over a 10-15 year period. But to have a robust plan from the outset and deliver the plan to the point of completion, I think is fundamental, and we're not always doing that. I think that's step one. Step two is having that longer term evaluation plan. But wars in Europe weren't predicted. The 40% inflation since 2020 on material costs alone was not predicted in any of the projects that took off in 2020.
Thank you. It's maybe just an age thing, but I'm not sure I would call 5 years as counting as really long term, but we'll leave it at that.
Well, from one age range to the other, Mr. Lake.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Smallwood, in answer to a question the Chair offered you in terms of the challenges that the government faces when delivering major projects, I think you mentioned one of the challenges is a dependence on the supply chain for skills, I think. Would you care to elaborate on what you meant by that?
So I think we're seeing an unprecedented ambition in terms of infrastructure spend in the next 5 years. And we're already seeing competing management teams, so the same names appearing on bid lists in different projects. We're seeing discrete skills shortages, so welding out the frigates in Rosyth, welders are in short supply. We're seeing civil steel fixers in short supply, which is what's encouraged me to take on the work to do a market analysis of capability and capacity. And it's not just in the core trade skills, it is actually in white collar workers as well. We're seeing huge external influence from the likes of the massive investment in Saudi Arabia. And there's a design house in London where they're taking several hundred designers out of the UK market. So we just need to be cognizant of that and understand, against that ambition to build more than we've ever built, have we got enough capacity to really deliver it? I don't know what the answer is, but I fear there's going to be some pinch points.
And as part of that very important work that you're undertaking, will we also have a better idea of what, if any, impact that has on cost and prices? Because it strikes me as though there's likely to be a higher demand on a very finite number of individuals.
Absolutely right. So how we manage that space is really important. So in the hospital building programme, if we don't get the balance between speed and building market capacity, we're going to see inflationary pressures in that specific market, and we need to guard against it. So absolutely it's a risk.
And in terms of, just very briefly, sorry, I will ask another question in a moment, but just in terms of the white-collar skills that you mentioned, is there any merit at all in looking at whether or not there is a way of increasing the government's own sort of skills in that regard, its own capacity. Is that something that...
I think you hit a really good point. I think we have an over-reliance on some parts of the supply chain. We have a large number of contingent resources working on projects, and I'm of the view that a smaller, more competent, capable owners team is better than a larger team with weaker skills. And I think we need to work through that as we go forward, and being smarter at how we manage in the supply chain and picking our right partners to do work that maybe they're better placed to do than we've been perhaps doing in government. So that's all in the mix.
Very interesting. And in terms of that work, it's quite a large piece of work that you're undertaking there, and a big study. But do you anticipate completing it by any particular date? Or?
We're hoping to have some early results by the summer. So June,
good.
July time, I would hope. It's not a short piece of work.
No. If I could then just go back as well, Mr. Smallwood, you mentioned about SROs. And I was just interested to know how, in your experience, how quick and prompt are SROs to come back to any concerns raised by the IPA?
I think we're seeing a very good response, actually, if I'm honest. An example of that would be the 70% of projects that return from red to amber or green within 12 weeks. So really taking on board the advice and recommendations from independent assurance gate reviews that the IPA have organised. I think we are seeing increasing understanding of what assessed and accredited really means, and really quite a good representation now appearing at MPLA. I'm requiring all SROs to go on the MPLA, everyone, and they're not going to get accredited unless they've been. So we're not seeing any pushback, and actually it's teaching them the skills that are necessary in delivering what are really complex, often unique projects anywhere in the world.
Thank you. Interesting. I've been to the MPLA a couple of times, and one session was very interesting. The room went silent as myself and the former deputy chair came into the room, because they were discussing how pesky politicians in politics would slow down projects, which we had then ended up being an interesting discussion about how you need to build in the political challenges of buying in public support, stakeholder support, and so on, and actually the constituency MPs concern, all those sort of things that matter too. When obviously you're looking primarily at the technical end and the delivery end, but do you have any of these discussions with ministers or to make sure that you're building in those other harder to pin down challenges?
Absolutely. We actually did start ministerial training to have that discussion. And we'd like to resurrect that.
Do the ministers do it with civil servants, or are they separate?
It was just ministers, but civil servants having the dialogue and delivering some masterclasses. They were very well received. I'd like to start that again. And I mentioned we're doing the training of the delivery boards, so decision-making boards, because I think there's a gap there in terms of knowledge and understanding. But you're absolutely right. All key stakeholders all need to be on the same page if you want to deliver a really successful outcome.
I throw out a final challenge. I'm not expecting an answer on it, but when myself, it was Richard Bacon, who was then the deputy chair of the committee, and we were very strongly of the view that all MPs should have the opportunity to go through this, because as we've seen over the years, in fact, particularly the last couple of parliaments, you really don't know who's going to be a minister. There's no guarantee. So then, I see Mr. Lake looking hopeful from his small party, but we have seen stranger things happen. So just to throw that out there, that actually there needs to be a better literacy about what's possible and what's not. But anyway, I'm not expecting you to answer that. That would be a bit unfair. But can I thank you very much indeed for what's been a really interesting discussion. It may seem to people watching a bit esoteric, because we weren't discussing a big particular failure, but we know that the getting things right, getting those ducks lined up, actually, and I quote Professor Gruber, particularly at Cambridge University, is really, really important, and that data and delivery, which is kind of your end of it, is really, really key to getting that across the board. So we hope that when we produce our report with recommendations, that they land in the right place with the right intent, because whichever party or parties win the next general election, the British public need projects delivered on time, on budget, and every pound wasted is a pound that could be spent on something else or put back in the pockets of our constituents. So can I thank you very much indeed. The transcript will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and thank you to our colleagues at Hansard for that, and we will be producing a report at some point after the Easter recess. Thank you very much. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.